The road to the village was nothing more than a winding, dusty path. Despite it being the middle of summer, the sky was covered in a gray blanket. Clouds lay heavy over the mountains like a quilt. The houses visible in the distance, with their stone walls and broken tile roofs, looked almost abandoned. The young man had chosen this village to put his university education into practice. He had sought a quiet, dark place, far from the crowds and noise of the big city. A lecturer's recommendation had caught his interest. There's still a man there who deals with old-fashioned cemetery work. He was fascinated by archaeology and believed in the memory of the earth and stone. He believed that humanity's past was hidden among these silent gravestones. No one greeted him at the entrance to the village. Only a few villagers watched from a distance, trying to figure out who the stranger was. One of them, an elderly woman, passed by the side of the road with heavy steps, clutching the basket in her arms tightly. She avoided making eye contact with the young man. The feeling of loneliness and alienation struck the young man's heart from the very first moment. As he approached the cemetery gate, he made eye contact with the old man waiting there. The old man's back was bent, his shoulders slumped, his eyes surrounded by deep lines. He had a rusty shovel in his hand and was leaning against the ground. His old overcoat was worn and faded. The first thing one noticed when looking at his face was the dark gleam in his eyes. It was as if years of staring at the ground had faded the color from his eyes, leaving only a gray haze. "Are you the one who came?" said the old man, his voice hoarse, a deep rumble. "Yes, it's me," said the young man. "I sent word that I would stay here. I would take care of the cemetery." The old man nodded. "You will stay in my house. I have room. There isn't much food, but you won't go hungry." His words were short and precise, devoid of mercy or warmth. Still, the young man thanked him gratefully. He followed the old man. The sight that met him as they passed the cemetery was chilling. The earth was mounded, as if recently dug. A few gravestones were tilted and covered in moss. Some had fresh flowers placed on them, while others had flowers that had long since withered. The weight of the air seemed to settle on the young man. When they reached the house, the old man opened the door. Inside, there was a heavy smell of dampness. The ceiling was low. Old pictures hung on the walls. An oil lamp burned in one corner. The silence inside the house, combined with the howling wind outside, created a strange dissonance. The old man led the young man into a small room. The room contained only a simple bed, an old table, and a broken mirrored wardrobe. "You will stay here," said the old man. "You will work with me. Day or night, it doesn't matter. Cemetery work waits for no one." The young man nodded. "It's no problem for me. I came to learn." An ambiguous smile formed on the old man's face, but it wasn't the kind of smile that inspired confidence. It was more reminiscent of the peace that only the keeper of a secret could feel. Then he quietly left the room. The young man sat down on the edge of the bed. The fatigue of the long journey had overcome him, but his mind was restless. He had an inner feeling that something was strange about this house, this town. He didn't know why, but this feeling only fueled his curiosity. That night, for the first time, he heard the old man's shovel hitting the ground with a hollow sound in the silence of the cemetery. Each strike echoed in the dark night. The young man went to the window, parted the curtain, and looked outside. The old man was digging the ground alone under the moonlight. His face wore a calm expression, as if he were carrying on a routine task he had been doing for years. The young man watched this scene for a long time. At that moment, an indescribable unease began to grow within him, and that unease would turn into real fear in the days to come. Even during the day, the town was quiet. In the mornings, even the roosters seemed to stop crowing halfway through, quickly falling silent. Although people appeared to be talking to each other on the street, they didn't raise their voices, avoiding the gaze of strangers. The young man struggled to understand the reason for these glances directed at him. It was as if everyone knew him, knew the reason for his being here, but avoided saying it openly. The old man didn't talk much during the day. He would wander silently around the house, occasionally drink soup from a bowl, then go straight outside. Most of the time, he was nowhere to be seen in the cemetery. He would disappear. But when night fell, the sounds coming from inside the cemetery became more distinct. From the very first night, the young man listened to these sounds every time. The shovel digging into the ground, stones being pushed aside, feet scraping against the earth. These sounds were never absent, even in the quietest hours of the night. One evening, the young man couldn't resist and went to the cemetery. Moonlight seeped through the gravestones, shadows mingling. The soil was damp and gave way softly beneath his feet. He found the old man deep within the cemetery. Shovel in hand, he was digging a new hole. There was nothing in the ground yet, but the hole was being dug carefully and meticulously. "Someone will die tomorrow," the old man said suddenly, without looking up. It was as if he already knew the young man had come. The young man's breath caught. "Why did you say that?" he asked. The old man did not answer. He continued to dig into the ground with his shovel. His expression showed neither sadness nor concern. It was more like the attention a worker pays to his job. The next morning, news spread in the village that an old man had died. The man had died in his sleep in his bed that night. The grave was already prepared. The old man had completed the burial before morning. When the townspeople gathered at the grave, no one showed any surprise. They didn't question the death or the readiness of the grave. It was as if this situation was normal for them. A heavy suspicion filled the young man's heart. Could this really be just a coincidence? Or did the old man really know something? Days passed. Each time the old man dug the ground at night. Each time a hole was ready by morning. And within a few days the owner of that hole was found. A woman, a young man, a child. The news of death came each time. The town accepted it silently. No one asked questions. No one rebelled. The young man, however, lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, counting the old man's shovel strokes. One night, the old man did not return. The young man waited until morning. When the sun rose, he went to the cemetery. The earth had been freshly dug. Another hole was ready. The shovel had been left, lying on the edge of the hole. When the young man bent down to look into the earth, he saw nothing but darkness in the dim depths. But what made his heart tremble was the stone at the head of the hole. A name was carefully carved on the stone, not the name of the person who had died the night before, but the name of someone still alive. The young man's heart trembled as he read the name on the stone. He knew that name. It was a little boy who passed by his door every morning in the village. He remembered the boy greeting him in the mornings, a grave already prepared for someone still alive. He understood then why the old man was so calm while digging the ground, because he was preparing not only the burial, but also the deaths in advance. The young man's mind was confused. Was this old man not just a grave digger, but also an executioner? Or had the town bowed to the fate he had prepared? When night fell, the young man looked out the window at the cemetery many times. But that night, the old man never appeared. This silence was more frightening than the sound of shovels. The young man felt even his own heartbeat blend into the silence of the graveyard, and that silence was broken the next morning by the news of the child's death. After the child's death, the young man could no longer find peace. The curiosity he carried inside him slowly gave way to fear. It was clear that something was wrong in this town. People were dying, graves were being prepared in advance, and no one objected. It was as if everyone had become part of this order. But the young man would not be able to rest until he understood the reason for this order and the role of the old man at its center. He followed the old man for days. He observed his behavior, noticing that his hands never trembled when he ate and that he never showed any emotion when he spoke. There was order and calculation in his every move. It was as if he had planned every minute of his life in advance. At night, he would go to the cemetery in silence and work until morning. One evening, before leaving the house, the old man forgot a small notebook on the table. The cover of the notebook was worn, its edges frayed. Among the dusty pages were lines written with care. The young man secretly entered the old man's room. His hand trembling, he opened the notebook. The first pages listed the names of people who had died in the village years ago. Next to each name was a date. The young man remembered seeing some of these dates on gravestones. But as he read further into the notebook, he froze. The notebook contained not only the names of the dead, but also the names of people who were still alive. There was a date next to each name, and these dates were in the future. What was even more frightening was that when these dates came, the deaths had actually happened. The child's name was there too. The date of death was yesterday, and yesterday he had indeed died. The young man quickly turned the pages. There were other names for the coming weeks. The dates of death of many people, from the elderly to the young in the village, were written down one by one. As he read the notebook, the young man's heart tightened. When he reached the last pages, his eyes darkened, because his own name was written on one of the last pages. There was a date next to it. The date was only a few days away. The notebook in his hand trembled. The pages seemed to want to close on their own. The shiver rising inside him dried his throat. At that moment, he heard the old man's voice. He was standing in front of the door, breathing heavily. "What are you looking for there?" asked the old man, his voice piercing the room like a cold, sharp knife. The young man hid the notebook behind his back, but the old man's eyes had already seen everything. The cold expression in his eyes briefly turned into a dark anger. "You shouldn't have looked at the notebook," said the old man. "Some things are safer not to know than to know." The young man couldn't find the words. He felt as if his knees had gone weak. He had only one thought. He had to escape. But escape was not easy. Where could he hide among the people watching him in the narrow streets of the town? Besides, he knew the old man would not let him go. That night, the young man lay awake. As he stared at the ceiling, there was only one image in his mind, a stone with his name written on it at his own grave. Witnessing his own death while still alive had made him feel alienated from the life he was living. As time passed, the days lost their meaning, and as the date written in the book approached, his heartbeat grew louder. In the silence of the town, the young man began to see every step, every glance as a sign. It was as if people knew of his death in advance and behaved accordingly. Some avoided eye contact, while others looked at him with pity. And amid all this silence, the old man continued to visit the graveyard at night. The young man now knew the sound of the shovel was not just digging into the earth, but also into fate. As the days passed slowly, the young man knew he was approaching his own death date written in the notebook. Every morning when he woke up, he looked at the sky, seeing his own end in the gray blanket of clouds. Every night, the sound of shovels he heard was no longer echoing in the cemetery, but directly in his heart. As the date approached, the old man's gaze also changed. His eyes, once cold and indifferent, now lingered longer on the young man. Even his silence had changed. Every step he took in the house, the creaking of the floorboards, seemed to the young man like a harbinger of approaching death. One night, the young man gathered his courage. He went secretly to the cemetery. The moonlight made the earth shine like silver. The grave had already been dug. A gravestone had been prepared beside it. His own name was written on it. The date was the next day. His heart beat fast. His knees buckled. When he touched the stone, a cold shiver spread through his fingertips. Standing at his own grave was like living while seeing death. He heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, the old man emerged from the darkness, shovel in hand. There was no anger on his face nor joy, only the determination required to finish a job that needed to be done. "This is your place," said the old man, pointing to the grave. "Whatever is written in the book will happen." The young man replied in a trembling voice, "This is not fate, it is your perversion. You are stealing people's lives." The old man shook his head. "No, I am only preparing. Death comes anyway. I am merely making room for it." The young man stepped back. His foot slipped, and he almost fell into the pit. The old man approached with heavy steps. He raised the shovel in his hand. The shadow of the shovel loomed large in the moonlight. At that moment, the young man felt great anger alongside his fear. He would not accept this false destiny prepared for his death. He grabbed a stone from the ground and threw it at the old man with all his might. The stone hit the old man's shoulder, and the shovel fell to the ground. The old man staggered, but the determination in his eyes did not waver. "You cannot escape," he said in a deep voice. "What is written in the book cannot be changed." The young man ran quickly toward the house. He slammed the door open and rushed inside, panting heavily. He noticed the old man's room was open. Inside, the notebook was on the desk. He ran over and grabbed the notebook. He tried to tear the pages, but the pages were like stone, impossible to tear easily. The fibers of the paper were stuck together, and every line in the notebook seemed heavy, as if written in blood. The old man appeared in the doorway. His eyes were fixed on the notebook. A wild expression, suppressed for years, appeared on his face. For the first time, his mask had slipped. His lips were tight, a hissing breath escaping between his teeth. "Give it to me," he said. "Nothing is complete without that notebook." The young man held the notebook tightly. At that moment, he understood that all the old man's power, all his obsession, was hidden in that notebook. If he destroyed the notebook, perhaps this cursed order could end. The old man took a step forward. The floorboards creaked. The young man backed away. He threw the notebook into the stove. Flames quickly engulfed the pages. The crackling sound of the burning paper echoed through the house like a death cry. The old man's eyes widened in horror. The order he had kept hidden for years was turning to ash in an instant. He lunged forward, trying to reach his hands into the flames, but the young man closed the stove door. The old man's hands recoiled, reeking of burning flesh. His face was contorted with indescribable rage. "What have you done?" he shouted. "You've ruined destiny." In that moment, the old man grabbed his shovel and lunged at the young man. A suffocating fight broke out inside the house. The shovel hit the walls, boards broke, and the room filled with dust. The young man resisted with all his strength, but the old man's arms, strengthened by years of habit, delivered heavy blows. Finally, the young man grabbed the shovel, wrestled with the old man, and knocked him to the ground. The old man did not scream. He just took a deep breath and whispered, "The earth does not forgive." The house was plunged into a heavy silence. The shovel had fallen to the floor. The flames in the stove were still crackling, turning the pages of the notebook to ash, one by one. The young man looked breathlessly at the old man lying on the floor. The old man's eyes were still open, his gaze fixed on the ashes in the stove. His lips moved slightly. "You erased the writing," he said in a low voice, "but the earth won't let you go." The young man stood up. His hands were trembling, sweat dripping from his forehead. He felt both great fear and great relief. With the burning of the notebook, it was as if chains had been broken and the air in the village had lightened. But the old man's last words echoed in his mind. Would the earth really let him go? After a while, the old man's body became motionless. His breath stopped. His eyes turned to a dull void. His hands, which had been clutching his shovel tightly, relaxed. Silence merged with the certainty of death. The young man collapsed to the ground for a moment, trying to catch his breath. Then he opened the stove door. Nothing remained inside the notebook. Even the ashes seemed to have been scattered and lost in the wind. When morning came, a different atmosphere prevailed in the village. People were talking louder than ever before in front of their houses. Children were running in the streets. It was as if a burden had been lifted from them, but the young man still saw caution in their eyes toward him. It was as if, even though no one said it aloud, they were aware that someone new had taken the old man's place. When he went to the cemetery, the hole dug in the middle of the night was still there. His name on the stone had been erased. Neither the writing nor the date remained. There was only an empty stone, wet soil, and the howling wind. When the young man touched the stone, a chill ran through his fingers. A question grew inside him. Was destroying the notebook really enough? That night, he dreamed he was inside the grave. The dull sound of the shovel echoed in his ears. The digging hand was not the old man's. It was his own. He was throwing the soil on top of himself with his own shovel. When he woke up, his throat was dry, his forehead covered in sweat. He stayed in the village for a few more days. Rumors spread that the old man had died, but no one dug a new grave for him. There was no stone for him in the cemetery. The earth had not accepted him. It was as if the old man's presence had not been erased from this world, but only withdrawn into the shadows. The young man decided to leave the village. When he came to the cemetery gate for the last time, the wind picked up. The branches of the trees rubbed against each other. He thought he heard a rumbling from beneath the ground. When he looked back, the shadows of the gravestones stretched out long. It was as if whoever lay beneath each stone was silently watching him. At the end of the road, the village sign appeared before him again. The rusty letters were the same. The wind was just as cold. He paused for a moment and looked back. The cemetery looked like a small dot in the distance. A voice inside him was still whispering, "The earth does not forgive." The young man continued on his way, but he never felt safe anywhere again. Every time he saw a new graveyard, the unease returned, because once a person had seen their own date of death, they could never escape that knowledge. When he returned to the city, he developed small habits. On his first day in a new place, he explored the streets in daylight. He checked the locks twice. He counted the shadows of the stones before turning away. He began to keep a notebook. On the first page, he wrote a single sentence: "Trust begins by standing firm in front of the unburied grave." Sometimes, surviving in a town is that simple. You separate the sound of the shovel from fear. You do not respond to the night's invitation. You don't go where the silence calls you, but where the light shows you the way. The young man learned this and decided not to forget it. The earth can hold anger for a long time, but it also holds the truth. When he stood in front of a stone again one day, he knew what will erase even the darkest writing is the right step a person takes without backing down, but also without rushing. He took that step and walked. The hollow sound of the shovel was now only a distant memory. When he approached, it was fear. When he moved away, it was a lesson. As the young man emerged from the heart of the night, he understood this: the earth does not forgive, but it gives advice. And this advice is enough to disrupt the longest night.